Everybody, this is Patrick Rocks, and this is my second video summary. So I've been looking into the phenomenon of musical performance anxiety, or MPA, and a lot of the literature is focused on professional musicians and how they cope with performance anxiety and what that looks like at the professional level. As a high school band director, I've noticed an uptick in my students over the past year in music performance anxiety. And so I was kind of interested in learning about how it affects students or non-professional musicians. And so the two articles that I'm looking at today look at elementary school students and MPA, as well as non-music major MPA levels. So we'll get into the first article. This article was called Pre-Performance Emotions and Music Performance Anxiety Beliefs in Young Musicians. This was written by Julia Kalenska-Rojaj in the Research Studies in Music Education journal. And just a couple of things to note about in the literature before diving into this study. The researcher identifies the concept of mixed emotions, which is the idea that an individual can have two emotions or three or more or multiple emotions happening simultaneously at different levels. So it's a more complex way of thinking about a person's mental state or emotional state. Another idea that's brought up in the literature is this idea of verbal labeling, which is the ability to actually name or label the emotion or emotions that you're feeling. And that's tied to this idea of meta-emotional beliefs, which is kind of the idea that you can think about or discuss how you're feeling. And that plays a big role in the study that we're going to look at. So the researcher has four hypotheses going into this study. One is that musicians' pre-performance emotions are complex, and that it can be modeled with this mixed emotion concept. Two is that musicians who believe in the negative effects of music performance anxiety will report negative pre-performance emotions. So if you think negatively about MPA, you're going to have a negative emotion going into your performance. Number three, that musicians who have negative feelings about their ability to handle or cope with MPA will have negative pre-performance emotions. And then lastly, musicians who have a negative opinion of their audience or thinks that their audience has a negative opinion of them, they will also have negative pre-performance emotions. So for the method, this study took place in Krakow, Poland. It had 222 students between the ages of 9 and 12, so in elementary school music programs. And the researcher put together a program called the Successful Performer Workshop Program that was an invitation to join for a day. And here's what they did during their time together. So to actually conduct the study, the researcher took the students through a visualization exercise where they were asked to think about their last performance. They were prompted to think about what emotions they were experiencing prior to their performance. And after they thought about that performance, they went to that visualization exercise. They were given a really brief questionnaire that had 9 questions. The questions were paired, so they could answer. They were based on emotions. So an example could be happy or sad, or anxious or confident. And so the paired emotions had a negative leaning or a positive leaning, and the students could select which one they felt matched their visualized experience that they just went through. And then finally, they went through a 3 multiple choice questions that were designed to learn more about their experience with music performance anxiety. So the results of the study showed that of those paired 9 emotions, the students selected the top one being unsure. So 69% of the students selected unsure. This is kind of an interesting result, going back to what was discussed in the literature. Being able to discuss or label your emotions is something that is advocated from the study. And the idea that almost 70% of the students were unsure about how they were feeling prior to a performance lends this credence to the idea that maybe students don't exactly know what they're feeling, or they don't know how to discuss their emotions. So this definitely comes up later in the discussion section, but that's an interesting note. The top four responses were all coded towards the negative side of emotions, which is another kind of interesting thing to note here. So once in the analysis, once they looked at the breakdown of the emotional responses, the experimenter did something called a cluster analysis, where basically they looked for trends in how students responded to their emotions, and they created 5 pre-performance profiles, and these were ranked from the more negative emotions to the more ambivalent or neutral emotions. So you can see here the breakdown. High MPA was the most negative, and ambivalent was a small subsection of students who didn't feel one way or the other about how they were feeling about MPA. So we'll dive into those a little bit more on the next slide. So as was mentioned, there were 3 questions that were designed to get the idea of how students were interacting with MPA, and there were several tables in the study itself, but I decided to pull this one because I think it shows the results pretty well. So the students were given a sentence stem: I feel, I'm afraid, before a performance, and then they could answer one of these 3 ways. The majority of students who were bucketed in a high MPA or moderate MPA selected that there was nothing that they could do to calm down. So the vast majority of those students, there was a correlation there between having negative emotions and then also feeling this kind of helplessness about an upcoming performance. And then on the other side of things, the more positive or ambivalent subtypes, pre-performance profiles, showed higher scores in self-efficacy, about that they could identify ways they could calm down, or that they didn't feel like they actually needed anything to calm down before a performance. So the takeaways, just checking my time here. Cool. The takeaways here is that the 4 hypotheses that were posited at the beginning were, for the most part, confirmed. The real big takeaway is that the feelings that an individual has about MPA and how it's going to affect them has a strong correlation to the kinds of emotions that an individual would feel before a performance. A result also showed that there was a skew towards more of the negative emotions and higher MPA profiles, at least in this sample of 222. But it could be worth noting that this could be something that's happening in our programs too, that if students were asked to kind of share what their emotions are, we might see a more of a negative skew than we expected. This research study advocates for this idea of meta-emotional training for students. As mentioned, 69% of the students marked unsure as their emotional state before a performance. I think this speaks to the fact that perhaps students don't have the vocabulary or labeling skills needed to really discuss or understand their emotions. And finally, this adds credence to the theory that MPA is a pretty complex phenomena. It's not just a single factor that plays into it. And so this study adds more to that base of knowledge. So the second study that I looked at, again, we're looking at non-professional musicians. Robeson and Kenny put together a study called Music, Performance Anxiety in Ensemble Rehearsals and Concerts, a comparison of music and non-music major undergrad musicians. Kim Robeson and Diana T. Kenny wrote this in 2017 in the Psychology of Music. This study came about because Robeson and Kenny identified non-music majors as an understudied population in terms of music performance anxiety, and they wanted to take what are considered kind of the indicators of MPA, that the that the field has identified strong correlations. They wanted to see if those were present in this population. So namely depression level, self-efficacy level, female gender performance setting, evaluation type, and then history of breakdowns in past performances. So the research questions that were written for this study was pretty straightforward. Is there a prevalence of MPA in non-music major undergraduate students? And then is there a quantitative difference between how MPA reveals itself in non-music majors as opposed to music majors? So going into the method, this study took place having students from 10 mid-Atlantic colleges and universities. They had 278 music majors and non-music majors participate. The vast majority of those, over, I forget the number, I think it was like 168, were non-music majors. The rest were music majors. The measures that were used, the instruments, it was a questionnaire that was given to students to complete within the last 3 weeks of the semester at a rehearsal. So the idea was, towards the end of the semester, there's probably a concert coming up. The kind of rehearsals kind of pick up intensity. That was the intention there. And the two measures that were used were the KMPAI, which is the Kenny Musical Performance Anxiety Index. This is a measure that the author Kenny developed and has been used pretty significantly throughout the literature as a way of gathering data on MPA. And then also this test called the PRIME-MD, which was designed to look at depression levels. So the results showed that the research-based hypotheses that were listed before, we'll show those here: depression, self-efficacy, female gender, performance setting, valuation type, and history of breakdowns. For the most part, the KMPA scores, or the measure that rates MPA levels, showed a significant correlation in MPA levels based on these indicators, with the exception of female gender. In the non-music major population, this correlation was not found. It's just something kind of interesting to note. That correlation between female gender and MPA has been found in other studies, but for some reason it was not evident here. This graph shows a comparison of the KMPAI scores between majors and non-majors, and you can see that majors have a higher score. Higher score indicates higher level of MPA. Although it's important to note, the authors point out the Cohen's d effect was 0.4, which is getting close to that moderate effect, but it still was a minimal effect. Shows that there's probably a relationship there, but it's not super strong yet. Requires more research. Another indicator that we talked about, that the PRIME-MD test, looking at depression levels. Depression level was the highest indicator of MPA, and this is pretty significant throughout other literature too, that depression levels have a strong correlation to MPA levels. If a student answered yes to question 1, that indicated some level of depression, and then yes to question 2, that indicated a higher level of depression, and you can see an increase of scores from answering no to both questions, yes to one question, or yes to both questions, that MPA increases based on level of depression. So just to close, the takeaways, that the findings that MPA is something that non-music major musicians experienced, just like many other populations that have been studied. There is an indication that music majors had higher MPA based on their KMPAI scores. However, the Cohen's d effect was marginal. It wasn't as strong of a correlation as relationship as was maybe hypothesized, but there definitely seems to be something there. Findings in the other studies that were discussed, looking at depression levels and performance type and performance setting, all we saw correlations with this non-major population, with the exception of the female gender. So that's kind of the wrap up here of these two studies. Again, looking at NPA and how it's experienced in non-professional musicians. Thank you.